Good evening, Monica.
Good evening, Dan. I think we'll go ahead and start, although we have one panelist who's stuck in traffic, and he should be here in another 10 or 15 minutes. Fortunately, he's on the very end over there, so we won't, hopefully he'll be there before it's his turn to join in. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out today. Is this thing on?
Yeah, it is someone.
Oh, it is, okay. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out today to join us for our annual event and also for this panel discussion on the nexus of water, energy, and food security. We have a distinguished panel. Oh, let me start by introducing myself. Sorry. My name is Monica Labiche Brown, and I am the Executive Director of Africa Development Promise, the organization that is putting together this event. We are really pleased to have a very distinguished panel here today to talk about energy, water, and food security, and the nexus of the three. We'd also like to thank MWH for sponsoring this event. And after this, we're going to have a reception. So we have another program, and so I won't talk too much at this time, and instead we will have more about Africa Development Promise at the reception. For now, I will turn it over to Julie Labonte, who is the moderator. Julie is with MWH. She's the Senior Vice President at MWH. And you will see her bio in the program, so I won't bore you with the information, but I just want you to know that Julie is also on the board of Africa Development Promise and has been a good friend. I met Julie through Water for People on a trip to Rwanda, and ever since then she has had a strong interest in the work in Rwanda and Uganda. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Julie Labonte.
Well, thank you, Monica, and good afternoon, maybe good evening, everyone. And on behalf of MWH and Africa Development Promise, I'd like to welcome you, and I anticipate that we are going to have a very stimulating discussion today. As one of the largest global consulting firm in the water sector, MWH is very proud to be associated with Africa Development Promise and today's event. Building a better world is our company's motto, which is in perfect alignment with what we're going to be discussing. When Monica asked me to be the moderator for this discussion, I felt pretty comfortable accepting. My thinking was that with 27 years of experience in the water business, my understanding of the water, energy, and food nexus had to be pretty decent. But to make sure I could keep up with this distinguished panel, I made sure to do my homework, and I did some reading in the last few days to brush up on my understanding. And oh boy, I have to say that that reading gave me a brand new appreciation for the complexity and significance of the nexus. To start with, I'd like to give you some facts that, frankly, I find pretty appalling. Over 750 million people in the world today do not have access to safe drinking water. 1.4 billion do not have access to modern form of energy, and over 800 million go hungry every day. Achieving water, energy, and food security is, for everyone in the world, is probably our greatest challenge at this time. The overall health of our planet's environment and the vitality of local and global economies depend on it. And in some part of the developing world, sadly enough, it's also a question of survival. And keep in mind that our failure to curb the emissions of greenhouse gases and its impact on our climate, in combination with an ever-growing world population, is only exacerbating those challenges. The intrinsic connections between water, energy, and food production have become more apparent in recent years, I think, because natural resources are becoming scarce. The increasing demand for these natural resources degrade the very ecosystem that our economy and societies depend on, and people's livelihood is closely linked to the health and quality of those ecosystems. And those who lack access to safe water and to modern form of energy and nutritious food are often the ones who are most impacted by the ecosystem degradation. Food production is by far the largest consumer of global fresh water worldwide. Agriculture accounts for about 70% of our freshwater use. Also keep in mind that food production further impacts the water sector through land degradation and changes in runoff patterns. The production of energy also contributes large amounts of water. Roughly 20% of the global freshwater is used for industry and energy production. Water is used to cool power plants, as well as to refine and produce various fuels, mine coal, and grow crops for biofuels. The overall food production and supply chain claims about 30% of the global energy production. And the link between food and energy is even more apparent today, as increases in the cost of oil leads very quickly to increases in the cost of food. As a society, I think we can no longer ignore the fact that our resource challenges are interconnected. We can continue to address these challenges in isolation, where water, energy, and food issues are dealt with in silos. Business as usual is no longer sustainable, essentially. Radical changes and new thinking is required. Over the last 5 years or so, the new concept of a nexus approach has gained momentum. This approach starts with a very strong understanding of the interconnections, synergies, and trade-offs between the water, energy, and food systems. This approach promotes integrated management and governance across sectors and scales, and it supports a global transition to a green economy. So in today's discussion, we want to explore where policies, strategic planning, and implementation meet reality. We'd like to take the principles that are at the core of this nexus approach to small communities and see how we may be able to adopt a more holistic approach to achieve long-lasting positive changes. So although our panelists will be given geographical freedom with their remarks, we will try as much as we can to frame today's conversation around the parts of the world that Africa Development Promise is active today, and that's Uganda and Rwanda. So now let's get started. And before I start introducing the members of our panel, I want to apologize to them in advance for if I don't hit the mark on pronouncing your names and affiliations correctly. Just in case you haven't noticed, English is not my first language. So I've got an excuse, I guess. So starting at the right there is Ned Breslin. Ned is the new Executive Vice President for the Wounded Warrior Project. He recently left Water for People after leading the organization as its CEO since 2009. Ned dedicated nearly 3 decades of his life addressing water and sanitation challenges in the developing world, while living in Africa for 16 of those years. Dr. Luca Pamanga, next to Ned here, is a professor at the School of Management at Regis University here in Denver. He is the founder of the Energy Africa Conference, Africa's premier power sector event. He is also the managing editor of the Journal of Global Commerce Research and the Journal of Current Research and Global Business. To my right, Madame Ambassador, Olive Weneke has been Uganda's ambassador to the US since mid-2013. Prior to that, she was a member of Uganda's parliament since 2001, where she chaired the Agricultural Committee. The ambassador's very impressive bio includes leadership roles on numerous national and global committees, forums, and associations focus on addressing a variety of issues, very critical issues that is, including food security, climate change, women and children issues. Immediately to my left is Dr. Susanna Kent. She is a sociocultural anthropologist at the Colorado State University in Fort Collins. Her research and teaching interests include globalization, transnational migration, gender, international development, and environmental anthropology. Next to her is Lauren Lebovich. Lauren is Vice President and Director of Emerging Market Growth for Oxley Consulting. And for full disclosure here, Oxley is associated with MWH, who I work for. Prior to joining MWH, Lauren worked for the Millennium Challenge Corporation, an independent US foreign aid agency that some of you are probably familiar with. And he currently serves on the Harvard Zofnass Sustainable Infrastructure Advisory Board. And if Jamie was here, I would introduce him, but I'll still...
introduce him because he'll be here in 5 minutes.
In 5, so do I still introduce him, or?
Go ahead.
Pretend that he's there. So Dr. Jamie Van Leeuwen currently serves as the senior advisor to Governor Hickenlooper after almost 4 years as his Deputy Chief of Staff and Director of Community Partnership. He is the founder and executive director of the Global Livingston Institute, that is an NGO in East Africa designed to engage students and community leaders in the development of innovative solutions to poverty. He's also a senior fellow with the Buckner Institute at the University of Colorado Denver School of Public Affairs. So here is how today's discussion is going to work. Each panelist will first be given a chance to share some brief remarks, and then we'll go transition into a Q&A session. As the moderator, I will start with a number of limited questions, and then I'll give the audience a chance to do the same. What we did prior to the discussion here is we asked each of our panelists to pick a topic that is directly related or that is associated with the water, energy, and food nexus. And we asked them to offer brief remarks as to why that topic is of interest to them and how it relates to the challenges that I presented in my introduction. So with that, Ned, you could show what topic you pick. I think you have...
Do I have to hold this?
No, you just show it first. And then you talk about it. And you've got
about... Do you want me to come up there? Or?
No, you can stay where you are.
Good. Thank God. So my name's Ned Breslin. It's really nice to be here. I think the word nexus is really important, but it's kind of heavy. And sometimes you're kind of like, well, what does that mean? So come with me to Africa, where I lived, like Julie said, for quite a long time. In the last 7 years, I was up in northern Mozambique, in a town called Lashinga, in a province called Niassa, which was known as the Siberia of Mozambique. So it was up by Tanzania and Malawi. It is about as big as New England, and has 120 kilometers of tarred road when we left. Totally cut off, isolated, really interesting place. Doesn't like being poor, but is poor. So Lashinga was the provincial capital, and our house was right on the, was basically three rows of houses off of the main road, and after our house were all traditional houses. I have 2 daughters who grew up there, and this was what we saw on a pretty much daily basis. So every day, it was a mystery whether the water would come on or off, and usually it didn't come on. And so my daughter would go with her friend, my two daughters would go with their friends, and they would walk past the school, and they would go fetch water from a hand pump that was quite far away, and if that was broken, they would fetch it from another one that was farther away, and if that was broken, they would fetch it from a dirty puddle, and they'd walk it back. My kids hated it. They hated it, right? They had these buckets, and they tried to bounce them on their heads, and they couldn't do it very well. You know, they're just not that coordinated, right? But they're sweet kids. And every day that they went, the only people they saw were girls and moms. That was it. That was the only people fetching water. And there's a bunch of friends of mine in the room from the Water for People world. There's Michael, there's Pete, there's Monica, there's Nina, and you know, we've traveled the world, right? And we mostly see girls fetching water at these places. So this is what they're doing most of the day. They're having to make choices between going to school, playing, you know, which matters, and fetching water, taking care of their kids. Their lives are fairly chore-based. On that walk, what they would see often was they would pass a hydroelectric plant, which is you, I think. Are you energy? So I'm teeing you up, my friend.
All right.
So they would pass this little hydroelectric plant. So the beauty of this thing was during the rainy season, which was kind of December-ish, a little rain in November, but December through March, we had electricity all the time. It was great. Like, we would come home and we had this light bulb on our front porch, and it would be on, you know, and that was like exciting. Not that we could do anything, we didn't have TV, you know, but it was exciting that we had electricity. After that period of time, maybe a month after, so sort of April, May, it would get more and more erratic, and by the dry season, basically we weren't getting any electricity because no water was pumping through that, and the generator in the town had broken down long before. So water was essential for the town's electricity, but it was very irregular because there was no way to build a dam, there was no way to hold water, there was no way to manage this. On that walk also, what they saw were tons of people with little mashambas, little farms. And what was fascinating about it was there were two types of farmers, right? So most of the plots you went by had maize, had beans of some sort, maybe had a pepper here and there, but it was pretty much maize-based. And those families generally used the rain, so they didn't irrigate very much, but they used the rain to grow their crops, and they would eat some and they would sell some in the market, and they were always on the fringe. And if the rain stopped or didn't come or was too much, they were done. They had a really bad year. What was more interesting to me was a number of the mashambas actually had some form of irrigation, usually a treadle pump because the water table was quite high. Treadle pump, I don't know if people know, something you kind of walk on and it pumps water from a very shallow well and then you can irrigate. And actually what they were growing was cotton. They were growing tobacco, whether we like it or not. And they were growing kind of high-end-ish peppers. And what they were doing very well is they were relying on the rain. When the rain didn't come, they would irrigate. But they were actually selling those crops and buying food. And they were generally better off all the time. It wasn't about growing your own food and eating your own food. It was actually growing higher value crops, getting money, and then purchasing food from other people, which I thought was interesting. Last thing real quickly is businesses around water thrived all the time. There was the utility, of course, but it didn't function very well. And so there was a series of businesses in Lashinga that were doing various things with water. One was you could work out with someone to come to your house and fill up your bucket every day, and you'd pay them some water. You could also pay that same person to go and take it out in the field and irrigate, right? A lot of people talk about these people like the mafia and water mafia and all that. These guys weren't actually. These guys actually sold for a reasonable price and actually provided a very important service given the failure of the local utility. What we're seeing over and over again in Africa now over the last few years, and one of the things we worked on, as you know, in Rwanda in particular, is allowing businesses to run utilities or run community-based schemes, make some money, and have different set of incentives to keep water flowing for agricultural production and for water consumption. And so I think what's interesting about the nexus, if you will, over time, and what was different from the time when I lived there to now, is there is a growing sense there is a business role for in the water sector for the provision of really good services. And the real question is not, is it private or is it public? The real question is who can bring water to people at the lowest cost, the most efficiently, and the most reliably. So for me, water kind of flows through all of these things. It's essential to food production, to income generation, to business development, to energy, but it's a women's issue, bottom line. And if you care about women, and if you care about girls, then water's your thing.
Thank you, Ned. Yes, very good. Luca.
Well, yeah, my name is Luca Pawanga, and as you can see, we've been seated next to each other, not by accident, but really by design. Because
we like each other.
Apart from liking each other, we have similar topics that we have similar topics, and I'm very passionate about this. Because I look at a lot of development plans, master plans that countries develop about energy. They call it 2030, or even when you look at the Power Africa initiative, none of those plans take into consideration the role of water. In fact, right now, I was discussing with some colleagues, there is a town that is going to be developed called Techno City in Kenya. And this is going to be developed right in the middle of a desert, pretty much. And the question that came to mind initially to me was, or just looking at the plan, is where is the water going to come from? But people just think of these two, water and energy, as two separate entities. But they are so intertwined. Without water, you can't have energy, and without energy, you can't have water, pretty much. Because when you go to the tap and draw your water, that is energy. There is a pump running somewhere that is bringing the water to your house. So that's the reason why I'm so passionate about this. And when I look at Africa, that's one of the things that I think of. And by the way, unlike Nate, who just went to Africa, I come from Africa, so I have more insights about what happens when you talk about women collecting firewood or collecting water and things of that nature. Now, when I look at Africa, I look at where we are now. Well, if you look at Africa, there is need for energy, because really everything that you do, whether you are communicating, whether you are manufacturing, whether you just cooking, all that involves energy. I don't think any one of you thinks about what they are going to do in the morning in terms of cooking breakfast. But as you heard from my good colleague here, in Africa, especially in rural areas, people have to think about collecting firewood and putting it together. That's a 2 to 3 hour chore. Whereas here, you're just going to turn the stove on and that's it. So if you look at Africa, it means that there is more need for energy. And right now, we have a lot of potential in terms of energy. The amount of energy that we use is so little compared to, think about the entire Africa. If you remove South Africa and remove northern part of Africa, the amount of energy you are using really is equivalent to how much the small country of Spain uses, which is ridiculous. If you look at the potential that Africa has, it has a lot of potential. If you look at hydro, we can produce up to 15,000 megawatts. I don't know if that means anything to you, but that is pretty much enough to power the entire of Africa, if we wanted. But very little of that is actually being used, and that's just in terms of geothermal. I beg your pardon. And if you look at natural gas, again we have a lot of natural gas. You look at the Mozambique alone; it has got 100 trillion cubic feet, and again that's quite sufficient to power. And to give you an example, Mozambique is going to be the second world producer of natural gas, assuming that it exploits if they go at the same rate of exploitation as they are now. So that gives you a sense of where they are. But they don't have access to energy like we have here. So what that means is that we are going to have, there is a movement, or there is the desire to develop these resources. And if we are going to develop these resources, it means we're going to need water. So that's the reason why I've got a lot of interest in this topic. Now, if we are going to need water, and we don't seem to worry about it, can we do something about that? And the answer is yes. Because first we have to take a look at the policies that we've put in place. How are those policies going to help us develop more water? First, we have to begin with how we are producing energy. Can we conserve water from the production of energy? Nate already mentioned the fact that we use the water for cooling the towers. In fact, even the presenter here did mention that. I mean, the moderator did mention that. We use it for cooling towers. We use it in all kinds, even for production. If we talk about hydroelectric, that means we're actually using water to generate the energy. Now, can we use it in a more efficient fashion? And the same question comes up when we look at the water supply. Can we use that in a more efficient way? And the best way to do that is to have this look at it as an integrated system. A system that we can now look at how we optimize it here and how we optimize it here. And like the way we currently have it, where we think, well, I'm the guy who's producing energy. You give me water. And the other person says, oh yeah, I'm the one who's actually treating the water that you are drinking, and I'm the one who's pumping the water to you. Give me the energy. But what is happening is all these things are happening in isolation, or what people might call, they are happening in silos that happen to be glass silos. So even though we see each other, but we're not really hearing each other, we can say bye or hi, but we really are not working together. So there has to be a policy so that we start working together. Now, what would that mean, working together? Well, if you are working together, one, you are going to start planning together. For instance, we can find out, well, instead of us locating this power plant here, where there isn't so much water, maybe this power plant ought to be located over here. Or instead of us using a tract of land for biofuels, where we can get more energy, let's think about having this for solar energy instead of biofuel, because then in fact that will even be better, because we can even grow crops that will be given to people. But since all these components are seen in isolation, even for food, then the planning, these guys are doing their own thing, these guys are doing their own thing, and the result is it's not optimized. So that's the reason why I would like to take, and I think maybe I'll have more time to talk about it. I know I've taken a lot of time explaining this. But this is just to give you the background of why I'm so much interested, and a lot of things that can be done. I think we'll have the opportunity to discuss that.
Thank you, Luca. Madam Ambassador?
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Listening to Ned talking about his daughters, I was wondering whether he wasn't talking about me, because I come from a rural area in Uganda. I come from Mount Elgon slopes, and I grew up fetching water. Probably I would be a little bit taller if I didn't carry so much water on my head. And I would be carrying it in a saucepan, which is used for cooking on firewood. The saucepan would be black with soot. So I did not only remain short, but I grew up with a very black spot on my head. Bathing, because I would have to collect the water for everybody else to wash, and I must bathe some of it. So I didn't bathe enough, so I would leave that spot there, you know, but there you are. I come from a country for which agriculture is our mainstay. 66% of our labor force is in agriculture. At this point, I would like to say that in that agriculture, of that 66%, over 70% of the labor in there is provided by women. Women, girls, and children. Where are the men? They're there. So, within that agriculture, we have population pressure. My country is one with one of the highest rates of growth of population, 3.2%. So, we have population pressure. Our agriculture is by smallholder farmers, most of whom are in subsistence farming. They are growing basically for their own households. We do have some commercial farming who are mainly in sugarcane for sugar, tea, cocoa, but basically our economy is sustained by smallholder farmers, of whom majority are, it's the women that are providing the labor. Talking about water, Uganda, talk about Lake Victoria. We share Lake Victoria, the second largest freshwater lake in the world. We have Lake Edward, we have Lake Albert, we have Lake Choga, so we're not short of water. But even then, we do have some areas that are kind of semi-arid. So for the majority of Ugandans, when you worry about water, they don't know what you're talking about. I know, because I come from these slopes of Mount Elgon. There is a lot of water there. But you see, you have the mountain and you have the valleys. So the water is running somewhere, it's running into the valley. Where I grew up, I have to go down the hills into the valley to fetch the water and carry it up here. I would like someone to harvest this water, put it into a pipe and deliver it to my home. And it is doable. But in Uganda also, we've got those semi-arid areas where water is a challenge. The agriculture that I'm talking about is a challenge. And basically, in Uganda, we have rain-fed agriculture. Irrigation is found in plantations. If you're going to visit Madvani or Meta, those are big companies that are in sugarcane growing, you will see irrigation. But if you're visiting smallholder farmers, there is no irrigation. We have challenges within that agriculture. Issues of production and productivity. Low production, low productivity. We are challenged by lack of inputs, genuine inputs, accessibility. We are challenged by limited extension services. We are challenged by financial resources. Remember, it's the women who are in this agriculture. And the women don't have this easy access to finances. The banks that basically provide finances, they are very intimidating to the women. The women till the land in agriculture, but they own it. So we have issues of land ownership. Women can access land, but they don't own it. And then the agriculture, the benefits that come out of that, the women share very little of it. So, talking about energy, only 15% of the population in my country, and basically urban population, access electricity. So you're talking about conserving energy and all to a woman who has no, I mean, her only source of energy to prepare her food, to prepare water for the husband to bathe, to warm it, is firewood. So, we have destruction of forests. Not enough households have got woodlots, you know. It's easy, the husband will go cut the trees and the wife will go and collect the firewood. So we have issues of environment. So even those who access electricity, it's not reliable. It can go off for 2 weeks. It's not there. So what are they using? Those who are using electricity for cooking, they have backup. The backup is charcoal stoves. Charcoal from trees that have been cut and burnt. So we use fuel. We use wood in the rural areas mainly. So we have issues of environment, of energy, of water, the nexus.
Thank you. Suzanne.
So I think already.
And I guess we forgot you were supposed to show,
yes, sorry,
show our
sorry.
topic. It's okay. Agriculture was the ambassador.
Gender.
Yeah. It's also interconnected that everybody's talk overlaps. Yeah.
Yes, so that's wonderful because the way has been paved for me to begin by emphasizing the point that these issues are gendered. So we have to use a gendered lens when we're thinking about them, analyzing them, researching them, and looking for solutions. We have to ask how the needs of men and women differ, and what works and what doesn't work for men, and what works and doesn't work for women. This might mean sometimes when we want to have conversations with them, for example, we separate them so that we're certain that the voices of women can be heard. We've already emphasized the fact that water scarcity impacts women in a very specific way, and I want to really emphasize that they are the ones typically who care for children, who care for the elderly, who care for the sick. There will be more sickness if there is poor water quality. At the same time, we have to take the concept that one way of thinking about it is the term intersectionality into account. Women are not a homogeneous population, so all women don't experience water scarcity in the same way. All women don't experience a lack of access to energy in the same way. For example, a population in many countries that will suffer in more pronounced ways are indigenous women. So we always want to take into account that there are complexities there. There's class, religious variables, ethnicity, and so forth that will further impact access and the impact of a lack of access to these resources. Another theme that I want to emphasize is that of economic processes. We can't ask this question of how are these issues gendered if we don't understand the underlying economic processes that shape things like access to food, water, and energy. So we do have to pay attention to things like free trade agreements, which is a very, very timely topic today. Are policymakers asking the question, how will free trade agreements impact indigenous women? Are they asking the question, how will they impact indigenous men? And typically the answer is they're not on the radar. All of these processes, whether it's palm oil extraction, mining for coal, food production, all of these things will have different impacts on men and women, and again, that intersectionality is important here. So earlier this month I was in the northern part of Colombia, so Latin America is actually the region that I know the best, visiting a coal mine, and it is largely indigenous people and Afro-Colombians that have been displaced by the coal mine. They do not have jobs in the coal mine. A lot of water is used as part of that process of extracting that coal. They are currently talking about relocating a river that is fed by aquifers, and as you can imagine, that's very controversial for the community because they're not convinced that relocating that river is going to translate into a place where they can still collect water. There are currently many communities that are dependent on that river. So another important theme then in thinking about these economic processes is that we have to have more women in planning and policy making. And even more ideally would be greater representation of the rural, of the poor, of the indigenous, of underrepresented people in policy making arenas. Furthermore, household needs have to be taken into account. Oftentimes it is more economic priorities that are the focus of policy making rather than individual households. And so the households of the poor, of the indigenous, single women households often get kind of lost in the shuffle. There are a lot of variables there, so one thing to keep in mind is that the history of international development is one that has largely ignored women. So we're kind of having to face this challenge of how do we get women consistently on the radar, and we need to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. And lastly, I want to note that women are involved at many levels. A lot of the activism that I'm aware of, women are at the forefront of it. They are committed to the concerns related to these issues, and they are at the forefront of it. Oftentimes, they are risking their lives because there are a lot of places where fighting for the right to clean water is very, very dangerous. So,
Thank you.
yes.
All right.
Lauren.
My topic, business, private sector. So this is a really important piece to this puzzle, and it's concerning the ability to mobilize private sector capital, private sector know-how and technology, and it's also about leveraging and empowering local private sector, local entrepreneurs, local women, local companies within these countries to be a part of the solution. And importantly, there's real opportunities for companies who understand the nexus that we're talking about today to build their business and at the same time contribute to solving these very important challenges. And there's three things that I want to talk about that I think are important considerations and factors involved that are influencing the ability for companies to really contribute here. One, I want to talk a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals, which are the going to be the next generation of the predecessor. This is a UN initiative, the Millennium Development Goals, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. In my view, from what I can tell, I think the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, will really have a catalytic effect in mobilizing a greater private sector participation in addressing issues around food, water, and energy security. And the reason I say that is because the Millennium Development Goals, while they had very measurable and meaningful results, but some of those results were uneven. So globally, you might hear that the Millennium Development Goals achieved their objective to have the proportion of the global population that does not have access to clean water. Globally, that statistic is accurate. In many countries in Africa, it's not. So there's been a lot of uneven progress there. And secondly, the Millennium Development Goals were pretty narrowly focused on eradicating poverty, whereas the Sustainable Development Goals are being designed, from the perspective of helping reduce the vulnerability of the world's poorest populations to the impact of environmental degradation. And secondly, they're really being designed to promote broader-based, socially inclusive, resilient, and sustainable economic growth. And moreover, a lot of the targets and the goals that are being set in the SDGs have much more explicit reference to food security, water security, and energy security than the MDGs. They have much more explicit reference to private sector and the importance to mobilize private sector resources. And they also deal with the interrelationships between these, the nexus, the interrelationship between these issues. So I think the Sustainable Development Goals will be very helpful in mobilizing private sector resources. Secondly, I want to talk about the business environment in places like Africa, which is steadily improving. I believe foreign direct investment in Africa has doubled in recent years, and it makes up somewhere around 17 or 18% of global foreign investment, second only to Asia, of course. And if you look at reports like the World Bank Doing Business report, I think just recently in 2013-14, 5 of the top 10 performers, top 10 performing countries that have undertaken regulatory reforms that are important to attracting private sector investment are African countries. That said, persisting corruption and political instability, lack of infrastructure, health, security issues, these are challenges for private sector to get involved. But in general, the business environment is improving. Why is that important? Because I think for businesses to really contribute to the challenges of improving water, food and energy security, it requires local solutions. These solutions need to be tailored to meet local needs. And so for businesses to make a meaningful impact, they need to invest in having on-the-ground presence and a knowledge and understanding of how these issues affect Uganda differently than Rwanda, differently than Malawi. So that requires a real understanding of the business environment, the socio-cultural environment, and the particular environmental issues that a certain country or region are facing. And with the improving business environment, that's attracting more private sector technology and capital and know-how to these issues. And then lastly, and I think really importantly, what I want to talk about is a concept of shared value business strategies. This, in my view, is a potential game changer. This is a trend where a lot of companies are really now beginning to change the core philosophy by which they do business, so that they are actively trying to create not only value for their company, but value for the communities and the environment in which they operate. It's not universal by any means, but there's a lot of thought leaders out there that are going beyond just philanthropy or corporate social responsibility to really change the way they operate. And they're doing it in a very integrated manner. I had one company tell me recently that the way they approach their business, they consider that only 20% of their company's value is reflected in financial statements. And the rest of the company's value has everything to do with the way they contribute to society and the environment and their social responsibility. So companies are taking a very active role in, in some part it's driven by managing social risk and all the drivers around, greater transparency, a much more empowered civil society, social media. There's a lot of independent third-party monitors out there that rate companies on their environmental and social performance now, groups like CDP. You have social impact investors and folks like that that are really putting a premium on environmental and social results, not just financial. But in doing so, companies now like Coca-Cola, who are investing a lot of money in improving water stewardship, yes, because it's important to contribute to society, but also because it's good supply chain management. Companies like Unilever that have something called the Sustainable Living Initiative, whereby they are actively trying to improve the social well-being and reduce their environmental footprint in where they operate. And other initiatives that are tackling things like deforestation, cocoa growers working with smallholder farmers. So this concept of shared value is really important. And the more that companies operate with a real genuine goal to create both business results and social results on the ground, that can make a real difference in tackling these very complex issues. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Jamie, if you want to
Sure.
find your way.
You just wanted to walk across.
I did not want to walk across. I was being a government official.
We got to do that next time.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ned. I appreciate it.
Policy.
I guess I'm talking about policy. And,
Yes. Right down your alley, right?
It's right down my alley, and I'm Jamie. I work. I actually have two hats. I work for Governor Hickenlooper as a senior advisor, and then I also run a research institute in East Africa, in Uganda and Rwanda, called the Global Livingston Institute. I actually just flew in last night from Uganda, and so I'm really honored to be here. I'm madly in love with Uganda, and I'm madly in love with East Africa. And so, so in my job as the governor's representative today, when he can't show up for these things, I'm supposed to welcome you, Ambassador, and tell you how happy we are to have you here, and you're supposed to pretend like you're excited that it's me instead of the governor. So, you know, I'm just, I think both from the state of Colorado standpoint, and then more from the work that I'm doing over in East Africa, we're really excited these conversations are happening. The fact that the University of Denver is having a conversation with the ambassador and talking about how do we look at East Africa and how we look at our developing countries differently. Anybody, how many have been over in East Africa in the last year?
Oh,
So,
wow.
well, a decent. Anybody who's been over there the last couple of years, it's changing. You feel literally, if you're gone for 3 months, it looks different. There are cranes going up. There are roads being developed in ways that we've not seen in the history of that in that region. And so these conversations are so exciting because, from a policy standpoint, if we don't understand that East Africa is changing, there's nothing we're going to be able to do to move the needle. That when we start talking about what is it going to take for East Africa to move out of poverty, what is it going to take for us to address the public health issues, the education issues, I think both in our own community here and what's happening in East Africa, it's going to be that public-private partnership. How do we create new jobs? I think that in some ways, without oversimplifying it, I think we've overcomplicated our complex social issues. And about 3 weeks ago, we were driving down to Kibale to where our research center is, and there was a huge jam. And so we got out because we were bored, so we walked down and we wanted to see what was going on. There's this massive truck that was stuck in the mud that was trying to get its way through, and there's an earth mover that was doing construction, which probably caused the truck to be stuck in the mud in the first place. And when they realized the truck was stuck in the mud and causing miles of backup, the earth mover went over, backed up, and they jerry-rigged this chain, and within 20 minutes pulled this massive semi-truck out of the mud, and then everybody started going forward. In the United States, that would have taken 2 days to end, because we would have had to call the right people, who would have had the authorities come, and we'd have to sign the right forms and call the right lawyers before we could possibly have that earth mover move that truck out of the mud. And the Ugandans figured it out in 20 minutes, and they said, we'll just pull it out of the mud with that earth mover over there. And it's not that easy, but I think we've overcomplicated it. And as we start looking at the role of the private sector, as we start looking at what is it going to take for us to change things, you talked to Dr. Safdie, who's the Worth Chair and is working on the sustainability issues and is creating jobs. You talked to Ned, who has developed an NGO that is rooted in creating reciprocal partnerships. It's not rooted in going over and fixing Africa. It's rooted in how do we empower the people in Africa to work in partnership with us so that we can really actually grow opportunities both in East Africa and the United States. The social impact funds and the private equity that people are starting to look at and investing. When you talk to East Africans in Kampala, in Kibale, in Lira, they're not interested in how can we come and provide them with more charity. They're interested in how can they go to work. They want to go to work. They want to go to school. They know they need clean water. They know they need education. They know they need good public health. But all that comes at how do you build that infrastructure? What does that look like? And so, I sit around the table and I look at the folks who are here. It's a like-minded group of people that I think the challenge for us is not so much how do we have this conversation in this room. The challenge is how do we take this conversation out of this room. The folks that are preventing people from going into poverty are the MWHs who are going over and creating jobs for people who are over there. And realizing where are those opportunities from an economic development standpoint. I just had dinner with the Prime Minister about 2 weeks ago. We had a group of philanthropists who were over visiting and just wanted to learn. We had an executive officer from DaVita, and we had the chief operating officer from the Opalmar Foundation. The Prime Minister showed up and didn't talk about all the things that were wrong with Uganda or where they needed help. He showed up and said, we want to build partnerships. We want to figure out how do we invest in economic development in our own country. We know we need better roads. We know that if you have to sit in a traffic jam for 3 hours, MWH is not going to put their headquarters in Kampala. But if we start figuring out how to address some of those issues, and we figure out how to start putting folks back to work, that's where you're going to start to see the needle change. And I think that there's lessons, interestingly enough, what I've learned and become so humbled by in my work in East Africa is how much we have the opportunity to learn from what East Africa is doing right now in terms of how we address our own social issues. The community rural development that we're doing down in Kibale and the community that we built our research center in is run now by 20 Ugandans. We actually just turned the leadership and the management over to Ugandans who's directing our kind of a poor man's Aspen Institute over there, and they're running it. They're the ones who are teaching us how to do really good rural community development, to really listen and think before we just show up and build something or create something. And so I think that the other lesson to be learned in these conversations is how do we share information, that there's things that they're doing in East Africa that we should be really looking at how do we address our own community issues here in our own country. And so I'm excited to be here, and I'm very sorry that I'm late today. And so thank you for still having me.
Thank you. Okay, so we have about half hour, and I wanted to just follow up on what you said, because in my first experience of Africa, I came back from Rwanda thinking, wow, we could learn so much from those guys. The way Rwanda has recovered from the genocide and the whole reconciliation process there is something that this country could so much learn about, especially given the overall politics in this country right now. So wanted to echo that. So I've got a number of questions in front of me, and you've stimulated a lot of thoughts here, and it's very difficult for me to pick only two, and because Monica wanted me to make sure there was enough time for the engaging the audience. So I will pick one on related to women issue, because I'm biased. And it was brought up by a number of folks, and through my volunteer work in Africa, I learned that providing the sustainable solution, in this case to the water crisis in the developing world, involves much more than building new canals and pump stations and whatever. It also involves changing some deeply entrenched cultural practices. As we've heard today, many chores are done by women. Women are the ones who fetch water, who fetch wood, who do the farming. And it struck me when I returned from my last trip to Malawi that the solution we bring involves significant changes in those roles. And we need to help women redefine their place in the African society. You know, it's part of a woman's life to stand in line for water for 3 hours a day, maybe 5 hours a day. And that's where she does all her social time. So if we bring water to them now, what is she going to do with that 3-4 hours of her time? And it's going to redefine the roles. And I'd be curious to hear, because oftentimes all these NGOs are there and they're providing the infrastructure, and then we leave. But then there's so much bigger changes that need to happen in the society to make this stick. And I'd love to hear from everybody here as experience with that. Anyone wants to elaborate on that a little bit? Am I right on the mark, or am I just...
You are.
Yeah. I think one of the major problems is we have this the cultural aspects where the duties happen to be separated. Okay, a man does this, or a boy does that, and a woman does this, or a girl does that. But as time has gone by, we've noticed that women are now becoming more and more important in the way we run, I mean, in the families as well as in the countries. I think there is a saying locally which says that if you educate a man, you educate an individual. If you educate a woman, you educate the entire village. So now we are beginning to see women playing larger roles in both the politics or the economy or the economic activities and so on. So it's not that a woman, once you give her time, she's just going to be laying there doing nothing. She's going to be productive. She's going to be doing the same thing that men are doing. She's going to be able to, and in fact, I think I'm proud to say Africa has led the way in having so many women presidents. And I hope we'll have one here in the US. But you can see with the kinds of things that they are doing. They are very functional as men, if not better than men in some cases. So that assumption, we have to get rid to go beyond those assumptions. And the way we're going to do that is by educating more and more women. Because most of the women, since we've been in villages, you will notice that they are given all these chores and they don't go to school. So in the end, they end up not being or seen as being productive as men, because the men are the ones who are there getting all these jobs, but they are not being given the same opportunities. So what we need to do is to give them similar opportunities.
Yeah, it's not a question of capabilities. It's a question of changing the mindset.
Right? Mindset and also the opportunities.
Can I say something?
Yeah, sure, please.
Yeah, actually, for women, let me say in Uganda, we have time poverty where women are. So give them those 3 hours. My goodness. They will have so much they can do with those 3 hours. And what the women are looking for, let's say just in agriculture, you know, when there is a double production, whatever it is, so much maize, that means the woman has to sit there and think of how faster she's going to remove the grain from the cob. But give her a simple machine, you know, where she can just sit, put the cob in the machine, and you know, the machine removes all the grain from the cob. Just that. Give her a small machine with which she can extract oil from simsim, oil from sunflower that she has grown, oil from granules. My goodness, she will spend less time producing the oil than if she's doing it on a grinding stone, because they do it on the grinding stone. So those 3 hours, the women will run with them, because they are already in time poverty. That's what I would say.
Actually, if you add to that, you will notice that women are more productive than men in African countries. Because if you look at the number of businesses set up by women, they're about 60%, I mean, the 6 out of 10, 60% are set up by women. The only problem is the failure rate for the women businesses tend to be much higher, and that's because of the network that they have set up is very thin, whereas the men have got this bigger network, and their businesses tend to be sustainable in the long run than those that are done by women.
Ned wanted to add to that.
I was just going to say that one of the things that always drove me crazy, someone said something about like women in development, or investments in women in development have been kind of underutilized, or not as much as other things. I don't believe that. I actually think there's been an enormous amount of investment in women-based programs that serve to literally separate them from things, and failed because they didn't actually challenge the real problem. So the most interesting programs for me when I was at Water for People were the ones where we set up, we worked, and water systems were built and all the jobs went to women. And so instead of making it like a side issue, we're like, no, we're going to make it actually central to the success of this particular program, and we're not going to isolate it like we isolate monitoring or like gender studies and all this stuff. It's like, no, you have to bring it right into the whole thing. And so I think what's been interesting over the last number of years, or the last decade in Africa, has been there's been more of a move to not separate women's stuff from development in general. That's been a good move. 2 is, we talked a lot about kind of mobilizing capital and shared value and all that stuff. I mean, the biggest change in Africa that I've seen, particularly in East Africa, has been the explosion of African businesses. I mean, Africa's like not waiting around for Coke to do a shared value deal, and maybe make some of their people drivers. They're actually creating their own businesses and all that. If you go to Jamie said we should learn a lot, or we're learning a lot from Africa. So a concrete example. I would still maintain the most interesting tech-based stuff is coming out of Nairobi right now, and particularly the iHub. Has anyone been to the iHub in Nairobi? So it's basically this place where people can go and they can come together and build cool apps, and some of the greatest organizations have emerged from that, like Ushahidi. And all of you know who Ushahidi is. They're the ones who do crisis maps and all this stuff, so when people are buried in Haiti under rubble or all that and they're texting where they are, that's Ushahidi. That's a Kenyan-based organization that has gone global. When you go into the iHub, who's in there? First of all, they're all Africans. That's huge. And second of all, they're mostly women. And this is in tech. If you look at tech in Silicon Valley, if you look at tech in this area, everyone's complaining where are the women? Well, they're actually in Africa. And they're actually driving this, and they're changing it. And so I think creative philanthropy, creative development is not isolating, but is driving home what Jamie said, jobs, and who gets these jobs, and women get these jobs, and those are big changes. And we're going to go there. We're going to go to that messy place, and that's cool. And two is, let's not forget that this isn't all externally driven. The emergence of East Africa in particular is coming because Africans have said, enough, I'm tired of waiting, I'm going to hook up that tractor and pull this thing out, and I'm probably going to charge you a little bit for it. Right? Right? That's cool, man. That's totally cool. And it is being driven by women, and it is interesting because I see more of that, more women-led, more young women-led in Africa than I do in the United States, frankly.
Can I make a clarification? Because what I was talking about was in the history of international development, so going back to the 1940s, women have not. So especially the first 4 decades of international development, where women were not on the radar.
I think women were marginalized. Women were on the radar not as central, but as like side projects. There were enormous amount. There was women in education, women in water. There were investments around that, but it was isolating them as opposed to driving it into the middle.
It's okay to disagree.
It's
It's okay to disagree. All right. Okay, I've got a bunch of other questions, but I think it's more important that you have an opportunity to ask questions. So at this point, anyone in the audience, please don't be shy. Oh, come on. I should not have said that I had questions. Okay. Okay.
Mostly for Luca and
You got to say who you are.
Okay, I'm Alicia. I'm with Africa Agenda as of like this week. So it's all very new.
Congratulations.
Not even living in Denver yet. I just wondered what your perspective was on the government's role in bringing water and electricity to the people of Uganda, and also if you want to mention.
Oh, the government's role is huge. In fact, it's fundamental. The government must lead the way. And as far as electricity is concerned, right now it is in the hands of government. But I'm looking to American investors to come and build dams on waterfalls that are running on Mount Elgon, where I come from. I would like to see electricity there. So we invite private sector to come and also invest in electricity, let's say. Come with solar, solar, geothermal, all these. But as it is now, it is mainly government that is driving the generation of electricity and making sure that it reaches those that need it most.
Can I just do a real quick illustration of this point? It's great. So let's imagine everyone here is all the money available in the world for water. Okay? So you represent the entire pot. So Monica and Lark, can you guys stand up because you're related? That's aid and philanthropy. That's it. All the rest of you are actually government. All the money is in government. It's not in aid and philanthropy, and it's not in private capital. It's actually in government. And one of the things that I love most about Water for People is our program understood that. So the question we have was, how do you take this philanthropic money and unlock that government money for the good? Because it is absolutely government driven. And we pretend like it's not. And we pretend like it's not. We pretend like this is an aid problem. It's not. It's government's got all the money.
Okay, but I want to follow
Yeah,
up on
okay.
something. Okay,
Yeah, well-
no, wait, because the question's going to go to you, Luca.
Oh.
So in your presentation, related to this, in your presentation, you said Mozambique will become the second largest producer of natural gas. That's impressive. How many percent of people in Mozambique have access to electricity or to energy?
Well, actually, you'd be looking about, in the rural areas, you'll be looking somewhere around 18%.
So what's wrong?
In the urban area, you'll be, yeah, and I think that's one of the questions. I was going to answer your question. But going back to your question, the problem with the development is it's not creating secondary value. If you look at Mozambique, most of the natural gas, it's just being exported. And all the rural area
That
people,
money.
what they are seeing is just a big pipeline passing through their land. Now, what needs to be done is to evolve the local markets. How do you involve the local people? How do you activate those entrepreneurs to start tapping into this natural gas? They can start creating all these stoves, they can I mean, there is no reason why we should even have people. Sorry, Ambassador. There is no reason why we should even have charcoal stoves in Mozambique. They should be using natural gas because they have it in abundance. But
So
what
why
you
don't they
see-
have it?
Many local entrepreneurs are in fact tapping into that pipeline, aren't they?
Of
As
course.
they should.
But the level, that has to be encouraged now by the government, because some of them have got no access to capital and so on. But if you create an environment, an ecosystem where you have capital, you have advice, you have the market here, you have ideas, and you combine that, you will create something super.
There was a question back there. Yeah.
So I'm Nina. I'm with Water for People.
Okay.
In my day job, but here as a supporter of African Development Promise. That's my more important identity right now. I really appreciate this broad palette of the nexus that you've given us, and I'm hoping to hear you talk about how we think about farm cooperatives, kind of in the big picture. Like, what is their place? How do they work as a mechanism of driving development, coordinating the various needs, however you want to take it? But I like the lens of the farm cooperative.
Yeah, and related to that is how does a better understanding of the nexus can improve the effectiveness of these cooperatives? Who would want to take that? Laura?
I can.
Well,
Yeah?
No, you first. And then
You bet. We're talking a lot on this.
Yeah, yeah.
you want me to start now?
Yeah,
Okay, okay.
And then we'll go
After
to
you.
Madame.
Well, so I think what's really important about the concept of cooperatives, and a common thread is some of the discussion that we've been having, is it creates vested interest at the local level, that the community, a vested interest in ownership.
Yeah.
Taking ownership in the assets, the physical assets that are required. It could be, small-scale irrigation or storage, refrigerated storage, whatever the case may be, and stewardship of the land. It creates vested interest in ownership in, the assets that they need to improve their livelihoods, and the ability to work together as a community to do that. But one of the things that I wanted to raise to the point earlier about women, and it's a common thread here, something that hasn't been brought up is the importance of property rights in land use management. Because in years that I've worked in international development, one of the things that impressed upon me the most, because I'm sort of an environmental background, infrastructure and whatnot, is the monumental impact that you can have when you address some of the issues around simply allowing women to own land or inherit land. If they're women-headed households, in many countries they can't even own a bank account or inherit the land if their husband passes, or they can't do it without their husband's approval. So in the cases where you're putting together these cooperatives, and undoubtedly there's going to be large participation from women, not necessarily 100%, but you involve women in that. You create vested interest and ownership in the livelihoods and the assets that they need, and you do have to address some of these very important policy issues around things like land ownership and owning a bank account to complete the picture. So I think it's really important, the work that this organization is doing, and I think especially on smaller scale, not the commercial stuff, it's really vital to changing the game.
Yeah, and you're spot on. Say in Uganda where you want to work, already the policy and legal framework is in place. Cooperatives have been there since the 50s. They've been through the challenges. What I would advise is, take a little time and understand, that where are cooperatives at in Uganda? Because they are not in a bad place for you to go and work. We have got savings and credit cooperative organizations, we call them SACCOs, and you have the legal framework and the issue of ownership. The issue of identified need for a group is very, very important. And if you're talking of savings and credit cooperative society, the women will save and lend to themselves while working out how to get to a bank. In Uganda, women can have bank accounts, but they will have their own money. First of all, they save, they can loan to themselves and go and do mushrooms as their enterprise. Okay, so the cooperatives, of course, you will be helping them in group dynamics, in financial management, in bookkeeping, how they can use their phones to find out the price of mushrooms on the market, because in Uganda that happens. Coffee farmers, they can find out the price for Arabica that day, Arabica coffee, which particular grade. They can find out Robusta coffee. They can do that. So in Uganda is a good place to go. And personally, I am very excited to associate with this initiative because I have real experience. I have initiated women's cooperatives, farmers cooperatives, where they can pull together, bulk their commodity, whether it is it's mushrooms or whatever. But I would encourage you to interest them in making a savings and credit organization, among them. So they have this little bank of their own. Right. They are in charge. The bylaws are already there. You go to the Ministry of Trade, there is a department for cooperatives, they have the bylaws. So the society just goes, picks the bylaws and customizes it to themselves, within their own means. So it's a great way to go.
But this doesn't happen overnight, right? And this is where I think the earlier point about redefining women's role in the economy and society, it's not just about bringing the water to the house to free up the 3 hours for the women. There's a lot of work that is being done by civil society, donors, private sector, both local and international, to work with the governments to create the regulatory framework, to change policies, to build awareness and train, because setting up cooperatives is not easy. So the work that organizations like Africa Development Promise do are critical, and it takes time. And it's not just about getting the water there. There's a lot of work after that to redefine their role in society.
There's a question over there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jessica. I'm a student here at DU. I'm actually leaving in 10 days to go to Uganda and research with the Global Livingston Institute for the rest of the summer. And my question centers on this idea of empowering Africa and Africans through partnerships rather than charity, and the changing landscape of East Africa specifically. And so as a young person who eventually wants to get my master's in international development policy and be working in what you're all doing, how could we be preparing ourselves now to enter this changing landscape and to be doing that work in a meaningful way that's not just throwing money at the issue?
Very good question. Jamie?
Well, I think that's what we're hoping to teach you when you're over there. Planes are chock full of people. Ned and I met this guy. Planes are chock full of people going over there to fix Africa this summer. And I'm not sure what we're doing.
And we're hoping to divert them to Canada.
Right.
go to Uganda.
And we're, you know, the dialogue that we should all be having, we're not asking the tough questions. Like when we go over, it becomes really, really clear when you go into Kampala and you meet the folks who are building out Boda Boda and have provided 900 Bodas to motorcycles to that those people now own and are driving their own Bodas and are making an income that they didn't have before. When you compare that to a very sweet, nice nonprofit that's doing education with a rural community, that when the founder leaves, that whole thing will fold up. We're not asking the tough questions. There's a finite pool of money. There's a finite amount of resources. How do we want to spend those resources? There's a lot of nice things that are happening. We're not asking the tough questions. And so as students and as community leaders and as business people and as government officials, we need to start having those dialogues and those conversations. And there's this belief that we're going to find the silver bullet that's going to solve all of poverty in the developing world. And that it's interesting, the co-ops, if you go, I had the pleasure of going and visiting and seeing what Monica's doing. Amazing that when you hear about microfinancing, you can go see microfinance is amazing. Microfinancing works in certain places, but not all over the world. And co-ops work in certain places, but not all over the world. And there's not a one size fits all. And we're not going to find it no matter how we look, how hard we look. And so how do we start investigating and looking at how do we engage each community? When I was running Denver's Road Home, as it started to show progress, I got invited all around the country to go and speak. And everybody wanted to know how they could do the same thing in their community. And the reality is you can't. Like, there's best practices, and there's things that we can learn from each other. There's things that we can learn about how you engage women and the role that women play. And there's things that we should learn from one another. But there is no way that we're going to Starbuck an NGO around the world and fix poverty. It's just not going to happen. And there's a little bit of everything. And what Lyra needs in northern Uganda is very different than what Kampala needs right now. And so my hope as one of our students, and as you grow, it's that piece of go ask all the tough questions. How are you going to be around in 5 years? What does that look like, and how are you sustainable? And how are you partnering, and what does that mean, and how are you impacting folks?
Yeah, I think the key is what Jane has just been alluding to. You have to look at sustainability. Can we maintain this in the long run? Many times people would go there, have a track of Nikes and give them to people. That's not useful at all. Okay, it's good for them, they have shoes, so what about when those shoes develop holes in them? What next? So you have to have something. First, they have to have a buy-in. You have to understand what is it that they're looking for, or what are they missing, and then work with them in getting them to where they need to be. You may not necessarily be there to see them reach the mountaintop, so to speak, but you've set the way for them to get there. So rather than giving them a fish, you're actually showing them how to fish.
Can I give you, so the best thing that ever happened to me in my life was I had a professor from Somalia who saw something in me and he threw me into northern Kenya. Now I'm a kid from Buffalo, New York, right? And all of a sudden I'm in a desert with camels. And the guy who ran the program said to me, and I was there for a couple of years, and he said, you know what? You don't know anything. You don't know anything. You don't know anything about empowerment. You don't know anything about sustainability. So the best thing you can do right now is shut up and watch and listen and don't touch anything. And it was the best advice I ever had, because for 2 years I really didn't have this idea of I could fix anything. I was like, I am from Buffalo, and this is sand. What is this? Right? I think the best advice we could give our students, I love the students who go overseas. I love it, you know, but you almost have to resist the urge to fix anything. Just take the time you have right now just to shut up and listen, because frankly, if you shut up and listen, you're going to learn more. And you're probably not going to mess it up. Seriously.
So there's a couple additional questions, Monica. Should we continue a little bit, or do you want me to go in closing remarks pretty quickly?
No, we can go over.
We can go over. There was one there too. I'm not sure who raised their hand first, but
I was going to actually follow up on your comment, because I work in the south of Mozambique, and actually in 10 years I haven't seen much changing. And what has changed, it's actually in Maputo, where when you listen to everybody who works for aid agencies, it's kind of this competition. Oh, have you been in Zambia? Have you been in whatever places? It's kind of like who has been at the toughest place. And this brings the idea that there is a recipe. And most of these people, actually, they don't even go to the place where I work. That's basically 300K from Maputo. They don't even know where this is. They know the beach that's 20 miles down the road. And so there is this kind of a construction of an idea of what is aid, when in reality what we are doing is just create a general recipe instead of looking at what it is that the village where I go actually needs. And I think that's part of the issue. So we are really good in terms of theory, and honestly, in 10 years I haven't seen much change in Majacas. So that was my comment.
Yeah,
because,
that's a great comment.
Because that's what I have been observing, and there is a big creation of a parallel economy, basically, where, for example, I cannot afford. I teach at university level, and I cannot afford working or living in Maputo. I go to Mozambique and 2 days, and then I go to Majacas because I actually can live in Majacas. I cannot live in Maputo with my salary. So
that's true of many cities. Many cities are being, I mean, Accra is impossible right now.
Yeah.
You can't find a house. And it's
Luanda is the most expensive
and
city in the world.
That's right, Luanda is the worst.
But then when you talk to people, and I think it's really nice when you talk about creating jobs, but what I've seen in the last few years in Maputo, it is the jobs that are being created is the maid, especially if you are a woman, you get the job as a maid, or a driver, or the guard. And if you go to the rural areas, there's nothing.
I've been told that we're going to need to move with the program, so this was a great discussion, and most of our panelists will be at the reception, so please feel free to ask some of your remaining questions. And so I need to close this, and I was trying to think about how I would do this, and I'm trying to feel how I feel. And part of me feels frustrated because these are not new problems. Been there, done that. We're about to spend billions of dollars on political campaign to elect a new president in this country. Just a thought of what we could do in Africa with that money is a big question for me. You know, we still have 750 million people without access to drinking water, 1.4 billion without access to modern form of energy, and nearly 1 billion people who go hungry every day. So I'm frustrated by that. But at the same time, I'm hopeful. And I'm hopeful for a number of reasons. You know, what was before considered an environmental issue only is now becoming an economic issue that is engaging a greater spectrum of the society, including the private and business sector. So that's maybe will be helpful. This new generation is very civic-minded. As we can see, young students are really motivated to make a difference. You know, being the next richest person in the world doesn't matter as much to them. It's how can I make a difference? So I'm hopeful because of that. I'm also hopeful because of the nexus approach. And the scarcity of our resources is making that more apparent now. And I think there's a momentum towards taking more of a nexus approach. It's sad that we must be almost at the edge of the precipice to really realize that, but that's a reality. I'm also hopeful because women are starting to be empowered in Africa, and I think that's very important. That's one of the main reasons why Rwanda came back from the genocide as effectively as it did. And I'm also very hopeful because of organizations like Africa Development Promise, and for people like Monica who have decided to leave it all aside and dedicate their life to making a difference. So I think I'd like to walk out of there not frustrated, but hopeful. Thank you. And Jamie, I think you were going to do a little presentation.
There you go. All right, well, I don't get to have the last word. The governor gets to have the last word. And Ambassador, again, if the governor were here, he truly believes in these kind of dialogues. And so, Monica, we should actually give one more round of applause to Monica, who's the artist. And thank you to Julian MWH, who has such an impact, not in our community, but globally. And so we prepared a proclamation on behalf of the ambassador's visit here today. And so these will get really, really boring for you all if you don't participate. And so, so you have to do the whereas. So I'm going to point at you, and you're going to say, whereas. See, that's collaboration. So, Africa Development Promise, a Colorado nonprofit organization, was founded in 2013 to help support women farmers in Rwanda and Uganda, and whereas. You guys are good. ADP recognizes that women farmers in developing countries are disadvantaged because they lack access to extension services, education, skill training, and markets necessary to boost their incomes, and whereas. When women earn an income, they can spend it on the well-being of their families, such as for nutritious food, school fees, and health care, thereby helping to reduce extreme poverty, and whereas. Africa Development Promise serves as a catalyst for economic growth by training women farmers and helping them build well-managed, competitive, and profitable agricultural cooperatives that strengthen the local economy, and whereas. ADP is committed to the cooperative enterprise model that is democratically owned and controlled and that provides benefit to individual members and the greater community, and whereas. About 50 more to go. Just kidding. Though through its outreach, fundraising, and education efforts, Africa Development Promise helps to raise the global awareness of Coloradans and to increase our participation in our interconnected world. Therefore, not I, but John W. Hickenlooper, governor of the entire state of Colorado, not just part of it, do hereby proclaim forever after June 25th, 2015 as Africa Development Promise Day.
Well, thank you, everyone. This has been a really amazing discussion. And as I sat here listening to the conversations, I was thinking to myself, there wasn't enough time. But seeing that we still have a little bit more time for a reception for us to break bread together, I would like to invite all of you to the reception, which is happening in the Tuscan Ballroom. And we will continue there, and there is a silent auction, lots of food, and we have a short presentation after that. Thank you.